So, welcome everybody to the final in-person session of ICA 2023. My name's Andrew Boyle and I'm Chair of the Organising Committee for this wonderful event here in Sydney this year. Before I start, I'd just like to thank our sponsors, in particular our platinum sponsors, RGA, Milliman and Actuary for their support for this fantastic event. I hope you all had a good time last night at the gala party. I'm still a bit tired from it all myself, but it was a great night. I hope you have all had a fantastic 3 days here for the in-person event. From my perspective, it's been fantastic. We've still got one virtual day to go tomorrow, starting off with the great debate in the morning, so don't forget to log on and have a look at the great debate. We started on Monday morning with the 4 Ds. We had a fantastic opening from the Minister for Finance and the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, who talked a lot about the actuarial profession and how we use data for good and helping us, the society, and helping them fix all of the great problems that society faces and to give us hope for a better future. Then Dame Inga Beale came on and talked about the importance of decarbonisation, digitisation and diversity. She also talked about transformational change, and in particular the human elements of change as she took Lloyd's of London through a massive change in its history. Change is an important part of the actuarial profession, and it's a theme that we come back to time and time again. And across the week, change was the first C, but there were many other Cs for the rest of the week. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but some of the Cs that we did tackle this week, Tim Flannery led an expert panel talking about climate change. Then Justice Hayne talked us through culture, conduct, community expectations and conflicts of interest, how we manage those so that we continue to stay relevant for all of our clients and our customers and the community we work in. Amanda Stevens led us through a fantastic discussion around the future of the consumer and how the expectations of consumers are changing and how we need to adapt and keep abreast of what those changes are so that we can continue to meet those challenges. And then we had lots and lots of plenary sessions and concurrent sessions on COVID and cyber, crisis management. I could go on. It's been fantastic with over 200 sessions, 400 speakers, and here we are today at the final in-person session. So we have a very special treat today. We have 2 speakers who are brothers. I've never done this before, so fingers crossed. I think we'll be okay. I'm really looking forward to having them up on stage shortly. So now, let's get on with it. First, we have Alan Joyce, who's been the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Qantas since 2008. In his time as CEO, he's overseen the biggest transformation of Qantas and the group's expansion into Asia. He is currently leading the group's recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, which has had a devastating impact on the global aviation industry. Alan served as the founding CEO of Qantas's low-cost carrier Jetstar for 5 years, establishing its operations in Australia and Asia. And he also held key positions before that with Ansett and Aer Lingus. As a senior business figure in Australia, Alan is also well known for championing inclusion and diversity. Alan will be joined by his brother Anthony, who is a corporate actuary at Medibank. Anthony is a highly experienced financial services professional across actuarial services with over 30 years' experience in the technical application in life insurance, superannuation and health insurance, and has also effectively managed people and client service delivery over that time. Please join me in welcoming Anthony and Alan to the stage.
Andrew, you may have never done this before, but I've never been interviewed by my brother before, so I hope it goes well as well. I'm a bit nervous.
Oh, you stole my thunder there, Alan. I was going to say, you know, this is the high point of your career, being interviewed by our brother in front of 2,000 actuaries, And
I think it's the high point of Anthony's career to interview the CEO of Qantas.
We've always been really competitive, and I think that's what drives us. Yeah, I was just going to say, give some context. We look like spring chickens, but we actually started our careers in late 88, 89. We just had a chat about was it 88 or 89, our memories are going. And we actually, I just Googled it last night, well, what actually happened in that year? And so I just have a few, and it was probably one of the most eventful years in the last 35 years or so. But the Berlin Wall came down in that year. So a lot of you guys would not have been born even at that stage. Tiananmen Square, the instance of that terrible event happened as well in that year. The world population was only just over 5 billion people. It's 8 billion now, so that's a 60% increase, which is crazy. And that obviously has implications for climate change and everything. To all the nerds out there that use spreadsheets still, Microsoft Office was released for the first time, just had Excel, Word, and PowerPoint. Which are still the three best elements of it. The Simpsons and Seinfeld were first shown on TV. Simpsons doesn't look anything like it was now, but what a series like, and Seinfeld, a lot of fans out there, I'd say. Then on leadership worldwide, we had in America, George Bush Senior, the older chap, had just taken over from Ronald Reagan. Margaret Thatcher was still in charge of the UK. We had Bob Hawke was in charge here. I think here he was a really popular Prime Minister. And then we can't not include the Irish Prime Minister. It's called Taoiseach in Ireland, and that was a really colourful character called Charles J. Haughey. So look him up, great story. That was almost 35 years ago. So we've had a...
And Anto's going to go through all 35 years, so tell you what. So I don't have to talk too much, which I'm very happy with.
But as I said, we were always being super competitive. So, I started my job in KPMG Consulting, and I was really proud because our mum and dad were working class. They worked their butts off, and a lot of similar stories out there, I'd say, to get a good education for us. And at the end of the day, my proudest mom was getting a job with KPMG and I wanted to be an actuary. I mean, when I read what an actuary was when I was around 13, I said, I want to be an actuary, and I achieved it. Well, I started the journey when I got the job with KPMG. But I remember I was working there, and our chief actuary had a list of all the actuaries in Ireland, and there weren't that many. There were only 60 actuaries in Ireland, and he had a list, on about 12 foolscap pages of their names, the company addresses, and their telephone numbers. Now, obviously no emails because it was so long ago. And I remember going and predicting, doing a projection saying that in a few years, there's 60 now, I'll be one of only 100. So I went home, knocked on Alan's door and said, Al, I said, do you realize, big head of me, that in a couple of years, I will be one of only 100 actuaries in Ireland, And then Alan, as quick as that, said, oh, do you realize, Anthony, not in a few years, I'm only one of 2 people that buy airplanes for airlines, So I quickly closed the door and went away, So it's always tit for tat,
I don't remember that, but anyway.
Yeah. So we want to cover a lot of things because, as you heard, Alan's been involved in a lot of social issues and so on. And I picked up some real gems from the talks over the last few days. And one of them was from a talk this morning, and it was in relation to diversity and inclusion. And leaders really can make a difference there. Now, a lot of us have just observed what's happened over the last 30, 35 years. Like Ireland, 35 years ago, not diverse at all. In our school of 1,000 students, we had about 998 white people, and there were 2 black boys as well. And that's how undiverse it was. Go back to Dublin now, walk down O'Connell Street to Main Street, and you'll see a melting pot of cultures, which is incredible. But Australia has almost always been like that. But Alan, maybe I just want you to have a chat over those years as a leader. What have you seen, and how have you influenced it? Because you rolled up your sleeves and you made a difference as well.
Yeah, well, I think probably a lot of everybody here would think diversity is a great thing. And I think from a moral perspective, making sure that you represent all of the communities that you serve and all of the communities in Australia is the right thing to do. But it does make business sense as well. And I was always one to promote the business positives out of this. If you take it from a customer point of view, a lot of minority groups, and I think the research shows that they're 4 to 5 times more likely to pick a company that they think represents them. And that's absolutely true of the LGBTI community. So things for companies to show that they're open and welcome, and that people can do well in those companies is really important. The second thing is that the employees are now looking for companies that have a purpose outside of just making money. And I think we find that in Qantas. We find that we've attracted unbelievable talent from all over the world because it's seen as a company that does support all forms of diversity. And then your shareholders are now asking for it. You know, I think I've told the story before when we started supporting marriage equality here. I had Peter Dutton tell me to keep to your knitting. CEOs of companies shouldn't be involved in social issues. I was at an event in Perth speaking to 1,000 people about our new Perth-London service, and I had a guy throw a pie in my face because of my support for marriage equality and Qantas' support for marriage equality.
Just to clarify, it was a lemon meringue pie? Yeah.
And it did ruin the company that produced it says, oh, it's fully organic, and Alan's suit will come out with dry cleaning very well. I'm tempted to take them to the ACCC because I did lose that suit. It didn't work. And then we had all sorts of people pushing back on it. But when I was in Boston, in the middle of that, I had one of our biggest shareholders who actually said, "What are you doing for marriage equality?" and said, "I don't think you're doing enough." Because the reason why we invest in companies like yours is because we believe it makes a big difference. And that comes true in how companies perform. Because the more diverse you are, the more inclusive you are, the better you are at managing risk, developing strategies, coping with risks, and the better your businesses actually perform. And we see that in Qantas. And my management team, you know, we've got the classical 40-40-20, just about 40% male, 40% female, and 20% that are LGBTI. So we hit that category at the senior levels. And I can see it coming through in all of the performances. And what's great, you're going for a company that had a gay Irish man in charge of it to now, for the first time in 100 years, a woman in charge of it. And I think people do notice that embracing of diversity. It is walking the talk and not just talking about it. And it does deliver on results because companies are better in all aspects in attracting talent, attracting customers, and attracting shareholders, because that's what now the community expects.
Yeah, no, good. But you do have an issue with part of your workforce, pilots, in that, and it's a global issue, isn't it, as well?
So there are two areas, pilots and engineers, where there has historically been a huge amount of male dominance in them. And I think worldwide there's 3 to 4% of pilots are female. Now Qantas is better than that, it's 6 to 7% now. And our intakes coming through the pilot academy that we set up in Toowoomba are 25% female. But the biggest issue we have, and I think actuaries have as well, is getting young girls to actually take STEM subjects. And that's a big issue of getting them interested. And the same in engineering. In our engineering, it's 97% are males. And we've set up now, we are setting up an engineering school, an engineering academy, so that we can help influence people coming in. And we decided at a very early stage that you need to show role models in this space, and you need to do a lot of encouraging young girls in schools to do the subjects. So if you have noticed, when we do things like the Perth-London, which is the first time Australia and Europe were connected, we try to embrace diversity on things like that. And the captain that flew that aircraft was one of our best 787 pilots, Lisa Norman, a female captain, to show young girls out there that there is role models in that space. And we think things like that make a big difference. Even when we launched uniforms for young kids, we deliberately, our chief pilot, he had his daughter wear the pilot's uniform, and we had young boys wearing the flight attendant's uniform, just to show that there aren't gender stereotypes in these roles, to encourage, again, young girls to think, oh, that could be me one day, and encourage them to wear the kids' uniforms that were on sale.
Yeah, that stereotype issue is really dangerous, because I was looking at the figures over the last few days. Only 1/3 of actuaries in Australia are female. It's actually slightly worse in the UK and the US, and I'm sure in other countries it's even worse. But you know, the fact that young girls are told, engineering, that's only for boys, you know, is just so dangerous. But even in Ireland, I mean, we have maths, compulsory maths up to year 12. So that's up to age 17, 18. And yet the figures are still quite low. So it's almost embedded and ingrained in the female brain from an early age, unfortunately, that no, I may have to do maths, but I'm not going to go into a mathematical career. So any potential solutions there, I know?
I think it's that encouraging role models, talking about the professions, trying to take unconscious bias out of these selections and processes. You know, there was one thing that was said to me at an early stage, that young women don't want to be pilots because the lifestyle, you're away a lot. And I said, well, how come that 80% of our flight attendants are women? So you get these blocks that are raised, which have absolutely no sense, and they're just raised as issues that are there and historically there. And I think it's up to leaders to say, well, we're challenging that and making sure that they aren't reasons why we can't select people in and encourage them to come into these careers.
All right, and just you sort of half mentioned it there, but I remember a few years ago you were at something like this, and some lady asked a question from the audience. And she was an Aboriginal lady. Do you want to?
Yeah, it was a Male Champions of Change event that a lot of CEOs in Australia got together to try and work on changing their organisations, led by Liz Broderick, who's an amazing lady who really has changed a lot of diversity and improved diversity in this country. But I was being interviewed, and we did a Q&A session at the end, and this young Indigenous girl put up a hand, and she said, do you ever think I could become CEO of Qantas one day? And I did say, it wasn't as public as it is now, and I did say, well, if a gay Irishman can become CEO of Qantas one day, then absolutely a young Indigenous lady can. And I think that's absolutely true. And we've made the first step with a female becoming the CEO in November. And I think one day, hopefully, we'll have a young Indigenous lady today that will get that role.
Priceless, yeah. Okay, great. And just on leadership again, climate change. We've had lots of talks this week on how really, dangerous it is, you know what I mean? And we may, I said spring chickens, but we're not really spring chickens. We may not see the really drastic effects of climate change. Like, they're always talking about the year 2100 and how bad it's going to be at that stage for health, mortality, and so on. But that's our children, our grandchildren. So, if you have a heart, you're going to have to do something now. But if you look at the airline industry, obviously it has a big carbon footprint. Yep. What are you guys doing? Yeah, what is the airline industry doing?
So aviation for us is harder than some other industries because there's no technology solution absolutely there today. But we were one of the first. We're very conscious about this. We're one of the first airlines in the world to commit to carbon neutral by 2050. We, in the middle of COVID, appointed a chief sustainability officer, and when areas were being stood down, it was one of the few areas that we grew because we knew it was the next big challenge for aviation. And for us, there's 3 paths to get there, and 3 areas we have to work on. One is new aircraft that are arriving. We have a new aircraft arriving every 3 weeks. I was up at the airport on Monday saying goodbye to a 717, which is an aircraft that we've had operating for 20 years. And it's been replaced by a 220, which is 25% less fuel burn and less emissions. So that's a big step change. And that's rapidly happening in our business, but 25% isn't good enough. So the other areas that we have to get right is, one of them is sustainable aviation fuel. And we put a fund together because there isn't enough investment happening in this space. So we put the biggest aviation fund of any airline in the world together, announced that yesterday, of $400 million. And we've made investments in setting up sustainable aviation plans. So an existing aircraft can use that sustainable aviation fuel, which is 80% less emissions than typical jet kerosene. And it can be produced from feedstock here in Australia. Australia has the feedstock. At the moment, we're exporting it to other parts of the world where it's being manufactured. And we're picking up SAF in Heathrow and in California. that is subsidised by those governments to get the industry started, and we're trying to encourage the government to get an industry here started, and that will create tens of thousands of jobs, take our dependency off foreign oil, and allow us to reduce our emissions. And then the final part is through offsetting, and we do very high quality offsettings. Our passengers are the #1 offsetters in the world. Most airlines have 1% of their passengers offsetting their carbon emissions. Qantas has 10% of its passengers doing it. And we invest in very high quality offsetting programs here in Australia and in the region. And we think we'll have to grow that and making sure that they continue to be high quality programs. The technology solutions, unfortunately, are not there. You've had people talk about battery aircraft, but to give you an indication, to fly Melbourne, Sydney, the batteries would have to be on an aircraft currently are 34 times the weight of the jet fuel on board. So there's not enough power to weight ratio to allow you to fly that sectors. We think someday, not too far away, you may be able to fly from Sydney to Wagga on a battery powered or hybrid aircraft, but doing the long sectors that we do, you can't. And then hydrogen is a long way away. Airbus think they may have a hydrogen aircraft ready in the 2040s. And the problem with hydrogen, if it's not frozen, it takes up a lot of space. So on an A330 flying to Asia, 1/3 of the aircraft would be hydrogen, and 2/3 would be passengers. And there's huge issues in trying to get the fuel on the aircraft, even if you had a hydrogen-powered aircraft today and that technology is available. So the other path is the only way we get there. And what we're saying, we have an obligation not only for grandchildren and children and the next generation, but also everybody here, and probably people that have gone in for this conference, benefits from aviation. We think we have an obligation to protect aviation for the next generation and not becoming a choice for people here to say, am I going to protect the environment or make the trip to Australia for this actuarial conference? That shouldn't be a choice people have to make. You should be able to do both. And with SAF and with sustainable aviation fuel and with offsetting, you will be able to do both. And that's our commitment. And we're one of the more forward-thinking airlines in the world in order to get there.
And the rest of the airline industry, are they?
It's moving. The whole industry is committed to 2050. But with a lot of things in this space, a lot of people don't have the firm plans of how to get there. We're making the effort now, because if you don't make that $400 million investment, you don't build up an offsetting program that is credible and make sure that they are really good offsets, and you don't invest in a new aircraft and a new technology, you're not going to get to that target. So you have to have something that is a credible way of getting to 2050. And there's a few airlines out there that have, not everybody does, and Qantas is one of the, I think, the credible airlines with that plan, because we spent a lot of time in getting there.
Hydrogen sounds a bit like, do you remember the Hindenburg? Yes. Yeah, is that the main argument, I suppose? Yeah. All right, that's brilliant. Thanks for that, Alan. Excellent. I'm really proud of him because of what he's done in the diversity. It's just amazing, risk management and COVID. So everybody in this room is literally a risk manager. We assess risks. We try to mitigate those risks, to charge appropriate premiums and so on. But you obviously have unique risks in the airline industry. So what keeps you up at night? Although having said that, at the level he snores, I don't think he loses any sleep over his risks.
God, he's giving away a lot of family secrets. Well, I think aviation is probably, when you think of it, my head of safety, who's a guy, an amazing guy named John Kissing, he said, when you think of aviation, what do? We put up to 500 people in an aluminium tube, put 2 rockets on it, and send them in the air. Now, if that's not risky in the essence of what's there, but yet it's the safest form of transport in the world. It's a lot safer than getting in a car every day. I think IATA said that out of 32 million flights last year, there were 5 fatal accidents in it. And you compare that to road deaths and any other form of deaths in any other transport, it is the safest transport industry. And why? Because over time, the aviation industry has got really good at assessing its risks and putting mitigators in. We're always on edge. So one of the things that we always do is never get complacent, and it's one of the things we always encourage everybody in the aviation industry to do. And we make safety the responsibility of everybody, all of our frontline people, as well as up to the CEO. And there were a couple of examples. And so the thing as an airline CEO you're always worried about is that call or that issue occurring. And I'll tell the story about the QF32, which was when there was a design flaw in an engine. So very hard to assess that risk, because Rolls-Royce at the time, it turned out they were producing an engine, a new engine, because they were new for the A380s, that had a problem in it that they eventually discovered was a design flaw. So the engine blew up on a flight out to Singapore. It pushed shrapnel all the way through the aircraft. The aircraft took a year to repair, and there was over $100 million worth of damage done to it. It knocked out so many systems on the aircraft. We had 5 pilots in the cockpit, some of the most experienced pilots in Qantas, and they managed to safely manage the aircraft on the ground. But the way the whole safety management system in Qantas worked, I was given a speech in the city, and I had my head of investor relations. We were leaving, and the share price dropped by 20%. And he jokingly said, "I didn't think your speech was that bad, Alan." But and then I rang the ops center and I said, "Is something happening?" He said, "Oh, we have an aircraft. Because there was rumors then." He rang some of the investors, and there was rumors that Qantas had lost an aircraft. And then your heart sank when something like that happens. And then I rang the ops center, and he said, "Oh, there's an aircraft in trouble. He's circling Singapore, but we haven't lost an aircraft." So we went in, immediately had what we call a crisis executive. And we had TV pictures in the boardroom where we held the executive, and we could see pieces of the aircraft being put on the backs of trucks in Indonesia. The news feed was that fast, and the social media were that fast. And seeing one of the pictures, our chief engineer who's in the meeting with me said, "Alan, you have no alternative. You have to ground the fleet, because this is this form of engine failure, disc failure, and that's really severe." And I said, "Chris, you need to explain that to me." And that was the toughest decision, fastest decision making we had to make, because we had 3 more A380s just about to depart with 1,200 people on them. And then you had immediately to say, are they safe to go? And we all agreed around that table they weren't. And we grounded the aircraft, and they were grounded for 23 days. And they weren't safe to operate. We were the only airline in the world that grounded them. It cost us over $200 million, but there wasn't a single thought about the money involved in it, because when it came to safety, Qantas was never going to compromise on it. And when the risk became too high to operate, we made the ultimate decision to ground the aircraft and eliminate the risk until we could identify what that risk was and how we'd mitigate it. And 23 days later, we were able to check every engine to make sure they hadn't got that design flaw and it was safe to operate. And that's when they went back in the air. But I was pretty proud of my people. I was pretty proud of the entire team. Not one person in that meeting asked how much was this going to cost. We just knew it was the right risk mitigator and the right thing to do by the brand and by the company.
That takes me back to almost 1989. I think it was 1988. It was the film Rain Man. And I don't know if most people have probably seen it, but Dustin Hoffman, basically, he doesn't want to fly, and Tom Cruise is trying to get him on this plane to, go to a certain destination. Dustin Hoffman quotes that Qantas is the only airline that has never had a crash. And are you still living off that to this day?
Well, I think it's something everybody in Qantas is proud of. It's something that I think everybody wants to be part of. It's the safest airline in the world. And that's true. Qantas has never lost a jet aircraft. And we started operating jets in 1959. So it's been a long history. And you can see how people are proud of it, because that QF32, I'll also say, we had to demonstrate that the aircraft was safe, because you had an aircraft that had so much damage. And the thing that also showed me how proud our people were, the crew that were on that aircraft, that experienced that issue, every single one of them wanted to go up to Singapore to be on the aircraft with me. We flew the aircraft back empty with me to fly the aircraft back, because they wanted to finish that flight, and they wanted to demonstrate, because they were absolutely convinced Qantas would not put that aircraft back in the air unless it was safe. And that was the commitment from our people and the strength that they had in the brand, the strength that they had in the company, that we were never going to compromise on that. And that was probably one of the proudest moments I've ever had. I've got a picture on my desk of us on the aircraft, the crew, the pilots that were originally flown in the upper deck of that A380 as we flew the aircraft back to Sydney. And that showed me the best of Qantas.
Fantastic. Okay, I know we've a fair few more subjects to go through, and I know we're probably getting short in time. The next one is COVID. I remember having a chat with you and an actuarial colleague about 5 years ago, and we were asking you, what for your risk management and so on, what are you fearing coming again? And we were thinking, and at the time we were looking at capital standards for private health insurance, and we were considering would a pandemic hit us, what effects would it have on us health insurers. Now COVID told us what the effect would be. We had to wait, but when it actually hit you, did you underestimate? Was your pandemic situation less severe than that or more severe?
It's a funny thing with these risks. I think you were informed by our history on these things. And Qantas was probably founded just after or just at the last pandemic, the Spanish flu, back in 1920. But the only other history we had of a pandemic was SARS. And it did cause us a lot of problems. We had a lot of our Asian flights that did stop. And we had a $200 million hit when that occurred. So we, believe it or not, it was always on a risk register as significant, but possible, but not massive in terms of the potential implications. And then when the news reports came out of China that this virus was coming in January, I think I rang my chairman and said, I think we should be wary of this because this looks like it could have an impact. And we then described what happened in SARS. And we got a young analyst to say at one stage, can you come up with how bad could this get? And it was the only piece of document, and I remember it very clearly. And he says, it could get to a stage where over maybe 6 months, we get to a stage where all the international borders close and the domestic borders start closing. And at the time we thought, that couldn't happen, could it? And they never close the domestic borders, would they? We're not going to be North Korea and South Korea, are we? Yet, the only thing he got wrong, it didn't happen in 6 months, it happened in 6 weeks. And it was crazy. And then you had to kick in to every system. And I think your risk management systems then, it's like a black box. You then just get the inputs coming in, which are a lot different than you were expecting. And everything that you thought you'd had to do, you just had to do on steroids and do a lot faster. And if you have the right people, the right processes, the right systems in place, I think you can manage anything. And Qantas had 11 weeks before it was going to go bankrupt. And I had to do unbelievably tough actions to get through it, but did it to survive because the whole risk management system, management process and people were set up to do that. And we got through it, managed to get the airline in a good position to come out of it. And now we just announced that we're going to have a record profit this year. Our balance sheet is the strongest it's ever been in its history. And we can go off now and buy well over 100 aircraft, as I said, one every 3 weeks. And if we'd have thought in March 2020 where we were going to be able to do that, we were just fighting for survival. But it was the risk management system, the processes and the people that got us through. Unbelievable set of circumstances. I don't think you could have ever put on a risk register because it wasn't part of what we've ever experienced before. All
right, so agility, yeah. But we've heard this week, I've heard it from 3 sources, that the next pandemic, right, well, one was Bill Gates 20 years from now, he's saying. 2 Portuguese colleagues actually estimated it would be in 12 to 13 years. And then there was another estimate from a demographicer. And so that's roughly 15 plus or minus 5 years. Is Qantas prepared, or can an airline be prepared for, say this was Ebola 2038, what would happen?
Well, I think you have to prepare for a whole range of things that could happen. Could war happen, potentially? In the region. It's happened in Europe, and we grew up in Europe. We never thought we'd see another war in Europe again. So lots of events could happen. So what are the things that you have to do as a company to ensure that you can manage your way through them? And I think you have to be strong. So Qantas has paid down a huge amount of debt built up over COVID. You have to have, in our case, shareholders behind you. We raised equity during COVID. No other I think publicly listed company did. So we have to have a really strong balance sheet with a lot of liquidity, a lot of capability to survive those events, whatever they are. And then you have to be dynamic enough to take the necessary actions and willing enough to take the necessary actions, tough actions in some cases, to save the company if needed, so that you can come out and protect as many jobs as possible on the other side. So I think it's a bit like a black box. Some of these inputs you're never going to fully predict. You're never going to fully understand how bad they are. You can have them on your risk register, but you just need to put all of those appropriate protections in place to handle whatever they were. My predecessor called it constant shock syndrome, and that's what aviation has had for a long time. There's been an event and different events every few years, and it's how you're structured to be able to cope with them that's the important thing.
Can I ask you, in 2015, Qantas invested in an actuarial firm, Taylor Fry.
Yep.
Why? Yeah.
Are there any Taylor Fry people here?
There is, yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, for us, that was a very important thing to do, because we believed that we needed the analytical capability, the risk assessment, the actuarial skill sets to do a whole series of problems. And aviation is full of different problems that we need to get resolved. The latest one that Taylor Fry worked on with us is the second time round that we did the Sunrise business case, which is the business case for flying from Melbourne and Sydney to New York non-stop and to London. As you can imagine, it's one of the biggest capital investments we've ever made. It's as big as Jetstar was, so it's a huge one. And we needed to get it right. And we had the Taylor Fry people in making that business case, identifying all the risks around it, identifying what extra revenue we would get from flying there, flying one stop. And we had to do it twice, because we did it just before COVID. I had board approval to buy the aircraft. COVID happened, and we came back last year and did it again. And having that skill set to be able to give the board confidence, the management confidence, that you're going to do a big business investment like that, but have deep analytical skills to evaluate it, is one of the reasons why we have them, and you do a phenomenal job.
Brilliant. Well done, Taylor Fry. Andrew?
So the reason why you can fly to London and New York non-stop is for the Taylor Fry guys in here. So slap them on the back.
Thanks for that. I know you could do this all afternoon, but I do want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions of you both as well. But just following on from that question you had then, so using data and analytics for both of you, it brings in cyber risk. And I don't want to talk too much about Medibank and its private cyber risk, but it does bring in a whole lot of other risks. Is there any risks that expose the airline around cyber?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, because, again, we used to call our safety management system a safety management system, and we changed to the Qantas management system. Because what we do, we figured around safety, you need to do in all sorts of risks. And cyber, for us, should be treated the same way as the risks around an aircraft. And what we do in aircraft all the time, we learn from what happens with other people's experience. And you're never complacent. So you never think it's never going to happen to you. If you do think that, you actually have lost the plot, I think. So you think, and one I use in the safety situation, when there was an Air France aircraft that flew from Brazil into Europe, there were a whole series of events that happened on that aircraft that called an accident, and the aircraft was lost. We went through every single one of them and said, could they happen in Qantas? And some of them could have. Like there was pitot tubes, speed indicators that were faulty, and there was a certain manufacturer that was faulty. We replaced them all. We did that. Some which couldn't have happened, and we call it the Swiss cheese. So when we look at the cyber incidents, one, we'd like it to be a lot more open, and I think the government is working on that, to understand exactly the root cause of these things, like we do in aviation accidents. And then you go through and say, well, what protections did we have in this that would have stopped the Swiss cheese holes lining up and the incident occurring? So there are things like, do you need to hold all the data that you hold? Yeah. And some of the data we were holding, a lot of companies were holding, there was a legal requirement to hold them. So you go back on passport information and say, well, do we need to hold it for 7 years? And work with the government? No, you don't. And so how can we cut that back? Are there things you can do with multi-factor authentication? Probably a lot of Qantas frequent flyers here now know that they have to enter in multi-factor authentication to get into your loyalty account. It's a little bit more of a burden to you as a customer, but it adds protections in. Things like making sure there's not many super users or contractors have it. And you look at all of these incidents and you can then figure out, well, what should those extra protections be for us? And you still have to keep on catching up with the cyber criminals or the cyber attacks because they're finding new and inventive ways to do it. And sharing more and more information between companies and between government and companies, I think, is the key to making sure we stay ahead of it, and not being complacent is really key.
One of the questions that's come through from the audience, and it goes back to some comments you've already made around the capital investment that you're making.
Yep.
And the profit that you're making this year, but at the same time, that has come at the expense at certain times around customer service.
Yep.
And you can't do everything to please everybody.
Yep.
So one of the questions here was also around, you've talked about 10% of your passengers doing the offsets. Why don't you make it compulsory and offset everything and just put it on the ticket price? So it comes back again to the competing interests of what's serving the customer, which customers.
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to do, you're absolutely right, what we're trying to do is give customers more choice in that. So some people don't want to do offsets for various reasons. Some people would prefer SAF, and we just can't get enough SAF at the moment, but we've signed an agreement with 5 major companies. So people like Macquarie, Australia Post, we've got KPMG. So they buy parcels of SAF that we're buying out of Heathrow, and they offset their travel with that. And some companies prefer that, and some individuals prefer that. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we get enough of both to give the customer and the individuals that choice. At one stage, we did have that the box was automatically ticked for you to do your offsets. 90% of people unticked the box. But I'm glass half full. The rest of the world, it's only 1%. Here in Australia, it's 10%. So that's a good start. And we just need to, and I think the other thing, I want to say one last thing that we're going to be doing more of, is we're going to show you on the website in the future what exactly those offsets are to make them real. So you see the scheme that's reclaiming sugarcane and planting trees in far north Queensland, schemes that are planting trees in the wheat belt in Western Australia, and then potentially using them as salve. And then you can see exactly where your dollar is going. And we think that will also allow us to increase it, because when people see it's tangible and see exactly what it is, that'll encourage them to do more. So we need more to be done in this space. Can I say on the customer side of it, the whole aviation industry, I think, had a hit last year, because the startup was a lot, and we did apologise for this, because Qantas didn't live up to its standards last year as well. It was a hit that the entire industry, people from around the world will tell you, was everywhere. But that wasn't an excuse that we didn't get it right. But we did work on it, because sick leave was 20%, a lot more than we thought. Supply chain issues, which are still there, you might be getting them in your industries. We still have supply chain issues. But we did a deliberate decision around August of last year to take 25 aircraft out of flying, have them as backups, and took the crew out, have them as backups for leave. And we did fix our on-time performance. Now we're back to pre-COVID levels. Our cancellation levels are back. Our mishandled bags are back to 18% below where they were. And we've beaten our competitor now 10 of the 11 months of this financial year. And we're well ahead. In April, we were 10 points ahead of them. So we have fixed those problems with Qantas. We've still a bit of work to do with Jetstar, and we'll get there with Jetstar, we think, in July because of those supply chain. And immediately, when you fix the on-time issues, you can see the brand dramatically improving already. We published a slide yesterday that showed our NPS going back to 2008. And there were periods where it was worse than this. There were periods when we had industrial action that we had a massive drop because our reliability was even worse. And it has dramatically recovered ever since we put that buffer back into the system.
I can see there's a lot of focus on measurement and data and analytics and understanding the business right down to everything and measuring that improvement over time. Another question's come through around finding the courage in times of adversity to make the decisions that you have to, but then also to follow on from that, the resilience in the face of people not liking the decisions that you've made and working your way through that. Where do you find the support and for that courage and the resilience to cope with it? And probably also get your views on that as well afterwards.
There's a great Theodore Roosevelt quote that I've been quoted for a number of years. He said, at the time of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing you can do is the wrong thing. The worst thing you can do is nothing. And you find that in nearly everything we've gone through as a crisis. The worst thing we could have done is just gone analysis paralysis, just gone at the deer in the headlights. That would have been the worst outcome. Now, were there some things over those years that you did that were probably not the best thing? Yes, but they were better than doing nothing. Because nothing meant that Qantas was 11 weeks from going bankrupt, and we couldn't allow that to happen. The thing I try and do to get through all of that, because you do, when you make tough decisions, when you're involved in decisions that can be controversial, was even things like supporting marriage equality, the criticism and the hits you get from things like that, which are the right things to do, let alone some of the tough decisions you have to make in standing down people, making people redundant, because the company is just going to go bankrupt if you don't. The thing I try and do, and it's a thing I was taught at a very early stage when I worked in Aer Lingus, is mindfulness and compartmentalization. So when you're here, you're completely thinking about this. When you're in a meeting, thinking about SAF and climate change, which we were in the middle of COVID, you were just managing that. When you were thinking about how we survived COVID and making those calls. And then when you get home, you completely switch off it. You don't read the media. You don't look at social media, you don't look at the TV, and you relax. And that works really well for me, and it's one of the reasons I've always been able to get through probably some of the most stressful moments.
Yeah, just be honest. You know, more often than not, it's black and white. This is the way it is. Don't try and code it up. It is what it is, and be honest, totally honest, transparent, and just get on with it. But I found Alan is even when we were young kids, I was always very diplomatic. If there's a small issue, maybe someone is slightly insulted, we want to get in a fight, I'm really diplomatic. All good. Now I will if someone insulted my wife or my brothers or whatever, I'd go mad and I would want to jump on them. But with Alan, he will not let anything go. You know what I mean? He almost, and that's what's driven him, I think. That's the element. I remember giving him a buzz, just a small funny story. It was just before Alan was famous for locking, or for actually grounding Qantas. First time it's ever happened in the world in 2011. And I remember I rang him on a Saturday and I said, oh, hey Al. And he goes, I can't speak right now. And I said, oh, okay, I'll ring you back later. Put the phone down and put the TV on. And to look for something from one of my kids, a kids program, and suddenly Alan was walking out live to ground the airline. And I thought, whoa, And I was like, he actually answered the call. If I was in that position, I would not have answered the call. I'd be just focused. But
I was worried about my brother, thinking there's a family crisis. How am I going to handle this?
But he's got this drive that I haven't seen in anyone. Like any injustice, he just goes after it. He will not let it go, whereas I'm more diplomat, I think, Sorry.
That's good.
We had a consumer futurist earlier in the week, putting your futurist hat on and just looking forward. There's a few things going on around technology and artificial intelligence and the like, and there's a few questions around that. But there's also changing demography and also what we've just gone through is with new technologies to allow people to not fly for certain travel, but also then to holiday more. What do you think the outlook is for the industry and for travel in general over the next decade or so, given all of that change that's going on?
It's a fascinating question because we're doing a lot of research on it at the moment. And what's definitely happened is that day trips have dramatically reduced. So people going Melbourne, Sydney, and spending a day doing it. We've seen a big drop in that in the corporate market. The SME market still is big because SME market, I think, is more interactions with people and connecting with their customers and suppliers. So that's nearly back to where it was before COVID. But the one that's boomed, so maybe that same day travel will never fully get back or will take a while to get back to pre-COVID levels. But what is boomed is because everybody's working at home and working for different locations, is this new market, which is people can go on a holiday and work on a holiday. And that is massive. So it's a weird thing when technology comes in. We've always found it in aviation that there's a give and take. It may take something away, but it gives a lot more back. And I think it's the same with artificial intelligence. Everybody's always worried in the Industrial Revolution, when the internet came along, that was going to destroy jobs, but we've always found other jobs. And it created other jobs and things to do. And we're looking at it in that space. I think we're a long time away. I don't know how good your internet connections were during COVID, but I did say we're a long time away from, certainly I won't be flying on it in my lifetime, on a pilotless aircraft. I can imagine them trying to do it from the ground and the internet connection kicks out. I certainly, if my internet connection is anything to go by, I won't be on that aircraft if that happens. But so we're a long time away from some of these jobs that we all depend on disappearing. Technology helps. Technology's helped make aviation the safest travel in the world, but is it going to replace some of these jobs? I don't think so.
I think that answered one of the other questions here about when will we have a robot flying the plane, but that's a while away yet.
I think that's a long. The technology is getting better and better on aircraft, and there's a lot more automation. But there's been, for example, when the QF32 happened and that engine blew up, we needed all 5 of those pilots in the cockpits to help with that aircraft, because a lot of the systems cut out, and it wouldn't have landed safely if there wasn't pilots on board.
But aren't Boeing talking about a single pilot now, potentially?
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you travel on that plane?
I think that we're a long way away from that as well, and I think you're going to have 2 pilots in the cockpit because of the way it works and some of the other risks that are there for a long time. And I think some of these things are more academic, like the hydrogen aircraft. I hope we get that at some stage, but I think we're a long way away from that happening as well. So people try new technologies and try things, but I think the way we work today has made aviation the safest industry in the world, and I think it's the way it's going to be for some time.
We had a session upstairs earlier today, which I stepped into for a little while, on professionalism and ethics.
Yes.
And we're talking about the proud safety record, which I think requires a huge courage from a lot of staff to stand up when they see something going wrong. How do you to get the culture to that point and to maintain it so that everybody feels safe calling out an issue?
So what we look at part of the safety committee that looks at all of the issues coming around is how much reporting we get. And if we see reporting dropping, we get worried, and we look at it every area. So we like as many reports, because the more reports you have, the better, even on minor things, trip hazards, people noticing them, FOD, which is foreign object potential damage, like stuff drifting around an airport and people reporting on it. So we try and encourage and get the system of encouraging people in the training to report every issue that they see. And then it's a just culture. It's not penalising people when they report that something's gone wrong, and making sure that everybody lives by that just culture. And aviation, it's one of the reasons why you've seen this dramatic improvement in aviation over the decades, because it's got the culture side of it right. And then things like, one of the things we spent a lot of time on, we had an aircraft that went off the runway in Bangkok, the QF1. And there was an argument between the captain and the co-pilot about whether they should use reverse thrust. And the aircraft Actuplane, there was a 747, went off the runway. Nobody was seriously injured, thankfully. But what we then had to do was look at the whole crew resource management, which is in the cockpit, of how people can challenge each other to make and have this, and that there's not a hierarchy of a captain and a first officer. Everybody has an equal voice, and they can discuss and then come out with conclusions that gives you a better safety outcome. So there are things like that are also really important in the culture. And I find that becoming a mathematician or a scientist, my whole background was the whole scientific method, that you have a hypothesis to make a decision. And particularly when you don't have a huge amount of facts to prove that hypothesis one way or another. It's the fastest way of getting to a decision. But you're dependent on people challenging you. You're dependent on people having an argument, and you're dependent on people not thinking, because the CEO says it, that we have to do it. And we work really well as a team like that. Everybody challenges each other. And that's what makes a good safety culture work. It makes a good business culture work because you don't have everybody with the same group thinking because they're willing to challenge the CEO or the CFO because that's what they like and that's how they formulate a decision.
I have got questions streaming through here. One of them is actually about how airlines could possibly calculate their airfares without employing an actuary. But we don't need to go there today. But I would like to ask you both, because we are rapidly running out of time, but I would like to ask a question of each of you to wrap up. So just looking back on your careers to date, and one question here is what are you going to do when you retire? But what is the biggest influence on your personal career, what it was or who it was, and a moment that you're really proud of during your career? Anthony first.
Yeah, so I think it's just the bosses I've had. I've been incredibly lucky to have about 4 or 5 really great bosses in my life. And the first one was when I started my career in KPMG. This lady who was exceptional. Her name's Breed Horton, if this goes out to Ireland. And I just think she's amazing. And unfortunately, had she been a man, she would have been, managing partner, everything like all those years ago. But an absolutely incredible woman, empathetic, but just amazing. Because, a young lad just going into an actuarial job at the age of 20 and, no internet, nothing at all, and she was so supportive. So she basically set me up for success from day one. And then along the way, I've just had great bosses, including today as well. Yeah.
Alan.
Well, first of all, I think, I haven't said much about Anthony, but I'm very proud of my brother. No, I am.
Give you the money.
I think family is really important to me. As Anthony said, we had parents that didn't finish secondary education. So having a brother like Anthony and support around like family like that is huge. And as you can see, he's one of the calmest persons. So he says, I won't let things go, but Anthony is one that calms you down and is actually such a good moderator within the family. And he's a core part of our family and has always been. And he is very competitive. He would never let me win a chess game or never let me win a tennis game when we were playing it. So he comes across as a sweet, loving, innocent person, but he is highly competitive as well. I think for me, bosses and mentors are, and that's why you do it yourself. I think they make a huge difference to your career, and you've got good ones that give you good direction, give you good advice. And even to this day, I've got 2 amazing chairmen I had in Qantas, Lee Clifford and Richard Guida, and I still think they're best advisors and people that you can talk to, and always get a good mentor, and then just pay it back as well. Because I think that's important. And the proudest moment, the thing I'm proudest of, I was the founding CEO of Jetstar, and I will say that is something that's democratized air travel. It just celebrated 19 years. Mm-hmm. It'll carry 10 million people this year for under $100. There were a lot of people in Australia that couldn't travel before Jetstar came in because they couldn't afford it. I remember on our first flight out of Adelaide, we had these passengers that turned up with no shoes. They couldn't get on the aircraft because you had to walk across the tarmac. So we had to buy them shoes, which cost more than the airfares to get them on the aircraft. But I was so proud of how it democratized air travel, because before then, there were a lot of people that couldn't get around this country. And it continues to grow. It's now 100 aircraft. It's the biggest low-cost carrier in Japan, in Singapore, in New Zealand, and here in Australia. And what was amazing about that part of the career, it's one of the things, you pick a name, you pick the colour scheme, you pick the seats, you pick the route network. You had to do all of that from scratch, and it's something never I think will come back as big as that in my career. So, and it was a big team effort with people that are still working there. We're all coming back for the 20th year next year, and it'll be one big party, but it'll cost under $100 because we're cheapskates in this.
Well, I can tell you're very passionate and proud about that moment. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so join me in thanking both Anthony and Alan.
Thanks.